Hello, welcome to the Maya Toolbelt. This is Michael. We've had a request to go over the options of the rotate tool. Rotate tool can be found on the left side of the screen. These are in the toolbox here. These are your editing tools for moving and rotating and scaling objects, and as well as other things. But the rotate tool can be found right here in the middle. Also, you can press the E key as a shortcut for selecting the rotate tool. You have Q for select, W for move, E for rotate, and R for scale. So Q, W, E, R, those are the top four keys on the left side of your keyboard for easy access to these tools. So the E key, the rotate tool. So if we double click this, we'll bring up the tool settings. And we have lots of stuff in here. Now a lot of this stuff is actually common to all tools, and we're going to get to them eventually. But I want to focus on the rotate settings themselves, which is this top section. So here we have common selection options, which I'll close that. We have soft selection, which that's going to be a video all on its own. I'll close that. And reflection settings, we'll close that. So rotate settings, we're just looking at the rotation settings. I'm going to hit the reset tool button up here, which resets everything to default. And also I should point out that I'm not using the most up-to-date version of Maya. I have a bit of an older version. I haven't been able to upgrade yet. So some of these settings are a bit different or name different things, or you might even have more stuff. Actually, I know you do have more stuff in Maya 2015. So I don't have access to those features, but hopefully you'll get the gist of the rotate tool going over what I have here. Before we go into all this stuff, let's create an object that can be rotated. So let's go to Create, Polygon Primitives, and we'll do a cube. And you'll see my tool settings change as I switch between movement and rotate and scaling and so on. But back to rotate. The rotation handle is this circular gizmo in my scene here. It has 4 different handles. This yellow handle, and the reason why it's yellow is because it's actually the one that is selected at the moment. When it's not selected, it's a light blue color. Any handle that you do select becomes yellow, just so you know. So if I click one of these other handles, you'll see it become a light blue. Anyway, it is camera aligned. So it's if you want to rotate your object along the axis that the camera is pointed at, like so, you can click and drag that outside handle of the rotate tool to rotate the object in that manner. The other handles are for the X, Y, Z axes in the scene. So you have your red X axis, your green Y axis. We'll just rotate these like this. Y axis here, X axis, and then blue Z axis. And you see how these correspond currently to the X, Y, Z axis of the scene, like so. So this is our object that we'll be rotating just for demonstration purposes. And let's look back at our settings here. We have rotate mode, and we have local, world, and gimbal. Then we have rotate pivot, default, object, and manipulator. Discrete rotate, and when we check discrete rotate, relative and step size become available. Center as virtual trackball is a checkbox here. Preserve child transform and preserve UVs. So we're going to go over each of these. But first, rotate mode right now is local. If we click world, right now you'll see nothing happens. If we click gimbal, you'll see that that outer ring is removed. So local, world, gimbal. So what local is, and that's the default value, if we hit reset, local is the rotation axis of the cube and not of the world. So if we rotate this cube, for example, you'll see that my Z-axis handle rotates with the cube. You see the blue handle is rotating along with the cube and is not aligned with the Z-axis of the world. It's aligned with the cube. So if I rotate the cube this way, the cube stays aligned in this way as it stays aligned with the cube's rotation angle. As well as the x-axis is aligned with the cube's angle, and the y, of course, is the same regardless. And that's with rotate mode being local. If I turn it to world, you'll see now it switches back to being aligned with the world's axis, which is also where the cube was to begin with. So the two axes were the same at the beginning, but now because I've rotated the cube, the local axis is different from the world axis. The world axis is still the same. You'll see that the blue Z handles align with the black lines along the grid here. That is the world axis. So the world Z-axis, like so, and X-axis. So you see it's rotating along the diagonals because of the way it's rotated. Click back to local. The gizmo switches to be aligned with the cube. And you can change its alignment like so. Then we have a gimbal. Let me go back to the default position here. So with gimbal turned on, you see the outer ring goes away. And I'm back to the original position, so it's kind of aligned with the world. So let me go back to local and rotate this way, like so. I'll go back to world, rotate it this way a little bit. So you'll see that on the channel box, our rotate Y and rotate Z have both been changed. So if I rotate Y now, you'll see that all three over here on the right, rotate X, Y, and Z, are changing. You see that? That's because it's displaying the local rotation of the cube, but I'm moving it in the world space, so all three axes are having to kind of compensate for that movement. So if I wanted to only rotate X, like so, you'll notice that my gizmo changed, and actually what I'm displaying here is the gimbal rotate mode. So again, I'll hit the E key to kind of reset my rotate tool. I'm back to world space. But if I click on gimbal, you'll see that my axes, my green, red, and blue handles, are kind of skewed and in weird positions. That's because these axes are aligned with these channels. So with a gimbal, you can rotate a handle and not have it rotate the other two. For example, if I rotate the green Y-axis now, it rotates only the Y-axis, which is the same as if I were to rotate these channels individually over here on the right. So I select the rotate Z channel, I'm going to click and drag. It rotates along the rotate Z. Same with rotate Y and X. And we can go back to world, hit the E key to reset, back to world space, and then there's local space. So if I zero these out, it'll go back to the default position where it was to begin with. So I don't really use gimbal all that often. I usually use local or world depending on the situation. So just have to kind of keep that in mind when you're wanting to rotate something. If you want it to stay aligned with the object, you'll use local. If you want it to be aligned with the world, obviously you use the world. And if you have other situations, what you can do, instead of going over here in the options and changing it to gimbal, you can just click over here in the channel box and it changes to gimbal right away, and change that axis here with the middle mouse button. So I'm clicking the rotate X channel, middle mouse click and drag, and it kind of switches to gimbal while you do that. And if you click local and world and hit E, it'll reset the control. And I believe in Maya 2015 local is now called object, I believe, but you'll have to confirm with me on that for yourself if you're running that version. So next we have rotate pivot, and the default option lets you rotate the object around its pivot point, which by default is the center of the object. The way you edit a pivot point is by holding down the D key, and you can move it with these handles to move the pivot point somewhere else. And when I let go, you see now my rotate handle is over here. So when I rotate this cube, it rotates around that point, like so. And that's by default. If we choose object, it's actually the same thing. because so by default you're rotating the object around their individual pivot points. And then manipulator is you're using the manipulator itself as a pivot point, which can be a little unusual considering the manipulator right now is at the pivot point. So what this really comes into play is for when you're rotating multiple objects at once, I believe. So I'm going to, let's just delete this cube since we've messed it up so much. And let's make a new one. Let's make a cylinder actually. Let's change things up a little bit. Alright, so now we got the cylinder. We'll create a couple of them. So let's duplicate this with Control D. Like so. Alright, so I got 3 cylinders here. I'm going to object mode. And all their pivot points are in the center of each one. I'm going to reset my rotate tool, and now it's at rotate pivot is default, which the pivots for each of these cylinders are at their center points. So when I rotate one, they all rotate all around their own individual pivot, not the one that's selected, but its own pivot, right? So I choose object and rotate. It does the same thing because by default it is using the object's individual pivot points to rotate around. So default and object are essentially the same thing. Now rotate pivot manipulator uses the manipulator as the rotate pivot, and because now my manipulator is over here for this third object, when I rotate it, you'll see now all 3 rotate with the one that's selected. These 2 pivot points, these 2 objects pivot points are still their center point, but because my rotate pivot is now the manipulator, it's using the object that is highlighted in green, which is the primary selected object, as the pivot point instead, and it rotates around it like so. So if you have several objects that are kind of grouped together and you want to rotate them all together without necessarily grouping them or changing their individual pivot points, you can select an object that is located where you want the point to be, the rotation point to be, and have that be the object using the manipulator rotation pivot, and rotate the whole object as a whole around that point. So discrete rotate lets you rotate in incremental degrees, because right now when I rotate this object, right now rotate Z is negative 11.02219, but if I wanted this to be whole numbers only, no decimal points, I would need to put on discrete rotate. So I check this box, and by default my step size is 15 degrees. So when I rotate this now, you'll see now it's going to negative 15, negative 30, 45, 60, 75, 90, 105. It's snapping to individual 15-degree increments rather than decimal points. The relative checkbox will maintain relative spacing when you're rotating objects, which if you want that off, just keep it off like that. And then we have center as virtual trackball. If I don't select a handle, I'll just click out in the middle of this tool, like so, this empty space in the middle of the rotation tool, click and drag, you'll see that it does rotate the object based on how I'm dragging. And that's because it's like a virtual trackball when I click on the center of the tool. Undo that, uncheck this, click and drag, and now you see it doesn't do that anymore. So then we have preserve, child, transform, and preserve UVs. Let's go to preserve UVs first. So by default, whenever you're rotating an object, the UVs are adhered to the surface of the object, and they are kind of stuck that way. Let me use a sphere as an example instead. Let's go to create polygon sphere, and I'm just going to apply a new material. Use a Lambert, and you don't have to worry about all this stuff. I'm going to assign a checker pattern to the Lambert. Okay, so now my sphere looks like this. So when I select some vertices of this sphere and rotate them, you'll see that the UVs are adhered to those points. The texture is rotating along with those vertices. The checkerboard pattern is moving along with my components' movements. So if I undo all that and hit preserve UVs, let's say I move these points up, you'll see how the checkerboard pattern stays where it is, and it's going to pop back just because of it's having issues with what I'm doing. There we go. Here's a good example. Let's go back to our rotate tool. So preserve UVs, I turn that off and rotate these points. You'll see that the checkerboard pattern shears around the middle because I'm rotating those points. Undo that and say preserve UVs, and now rotate, and the checkerboard pattern tries to stay where it is. You'll see I've rotated these points, but that checkerboard pattern has not been sheared like it was before, like so. So if you want the UVs of your texture to stay where they are, but you still need to edit the object, if you turn on preserve UVs, Maya will do its best to keep those UVs where they are, to maintain where your texture is on the object while you move points around. And that works with the rotation tool as well as the movement and scale tools as well. Let's go back, just turn that back off. So preserve child transform. This is in relation to objects that are parented together. So let's create a new sphere. Control D to duplicate. Let's move this one up here and make it smaller. And we'll just parent the big sphere to the little sphere. So select the big sphere, shift select little sphere, hit P to parent. So now when I select the little sphere and move it and rotate it, it rotates the big one as well. So preserve child transform is not checked. If I turn it on and rotate the little sphere, you'll see now the big sphere does not rotate along with it. So if you have objects parented like this, if you want to rotate the parent without rotating the children, turn this checkbox on and you can do that. So we have this tool settings box on the left side of the screen. Another way to access these settings, if I create another object here, like a cube or something, doesn't matter. I hit my E key for the rotate tools to see my rotate settings. So I have all my settings here. I'm going to click reset to go back to default options, and you have local mode, world mode, so on, object pivot point, discrete rotate for rotating in increments of degrees, and so on. And to get to this, you have to double click the move tool. We have a little X button here to close this. Double click the move tool to bring it back. A shortcut that's very handy for getting to these settings without having to use up half of your screen to do so is to hold down the E key, then hold while you're holding down the E key. So right now my E key is held down. I'll also click and hold my left mouse button. So now you'll see I have all of my rotation settings on the screen in this handy marking menu. You see I have local turned on right now. That's local rotate. There's world rotate. There's gimbal. There's discrete rotate, which is the rotating in increments. Then you have your relative and so on. Your reflection settings, which we haven't gotten to yet. Select, and you can have all your selection settings here. And I'm still holding down all these buttons. And here's your checkbox for center as virtual trackball, preserve UVs, preserve child transforms. And then at the bottom, if you go to rotate options and then let go, it'll then open up that window if you wanted that window open. So what I usually do a lot, if I notice that I'm rotating and you know what, I'd really like to rotate on 15-degree increments, I'll then hold E, hold left mouse button, turn on discrete rotate, and now that's what I'm doing, is rotating in 15-degree increments. And if I find later on that I'm rotating in 15-degree increments and I really don't want to, hold E, hold left mouse button, turn off discrete rotate. And now that's no longer in effect. So holding E, hold left mouse button, bring up your rotation options without having the rotate tool settings window open. And that works for all tools in the toolbox. If you hold down W and left mouse button, there's my move tool settings. Hold down R, left mouse button, my scale settings. Q, left mouse button, that's my selection settings. So that's a really handy shortcut for getting access to those settings without having to go over here and double click this and have this huge window open. Now sometimes you might want to change, for example, the step size of your discrete rotate. If I hold down E and left click, you see I don't have that option in here, so I have to go down here to rotate options to actually change the step size for the rotation. But most of the time, most of the settings you want are very handily located right here in this marking menu. So I think that kind of wraps up the rotate settings of the rotate tool. There's obviously these other settings that I will get to eventually. There's lots of stuff in Maya, as you can tell. I've done over, at the time of this recording, I've done over 50 videos, 60 videos, and I still haven't even scratched the surface, which that's the point, you know, of this whole series, is eventually, hopefully, as I keep making these videos, the library will grow, and maybe one day I'll come to an end. I don't know, maybe not. Probably not. But anyway, thanks again for watching, guys. If you have any questions, if I missed something, please let me know. And hope to see you next time.